On June 7th, 2008, a middle-aged woman named Kim Spengler was working at this family paint shop. She worked there, she'd been there for several years, and she was stocking shelves, going about her day, when one of her colleagues came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Kim, there's an alarm going off in the parking lot and we think it's your car." And Kim immediately, when she heard this, she became totally panicked. She thanked the colleague and said, okay. And then Kim, she went to the counter where she'd stashed her purse, and she grabbed her keys out of her purse, her car keys, and she put the keys into her fists like brass knuckles. She put the key kind of pointing up out of her hand. And so she's kind of holding her keys like a weapon. And she makes her way towards the door. This is in North Carolina, suburban North Carolina. It was in the middle of the summer, super hot. And she's got these keys in her hand, and she steps outside into the blazing heat, and she can hear the alarm going off. And she looks and she can see it's her car. It's definitely going off. But for Kim, it's like she wasn't really focused on the car. She's sort of anxiously looking around the parking lot, looking for any sudden movement. She's looking if anybody's coming up to her. I mean, she's totally on edge. And the reason for this is because recently Kim had left a very toxic relationship with her boyfriend, a guy named Ricky Simmons, who was 49 years old. Ricky and Kim had connected 5 years earlier when Kim was going through a really dark time in her life. She was struggling with substance abuse. She was just at a low point, and Ricky also was sort of at a low point too in his life. He also was struggling with substance abuse. He had just gotten out of jail. He had served time for manslaughter, in fact. And Kim, I think that she basically looked at him as being sort of like a troubled soul, but somebody that, still had a heart of gold in there somewhere. There was a kinship there. There was a relatability. And so that was 5 years ago from this point in the parking lot with the car alarm. However, a few months earlier, Kim had gotten the strength and become sober. And when she became sober, well, one, Ricky didn't like it. Ricky was sort of not an advocate of hers at all. And so they ended up breaking up, and it was a very rocky breakup. Kim at first thought that Ricky would sort of just get over it, but Ricky began effectively stalking Kim. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced. This is a few months earlier. It got to the point where Kim actually filed a restraining order against Ricky because he was becoming so sort of unhinged. He was so unhappy about, what had happened, about the breakup. On top of that, there was something else that really was sitting in the back of Kim's mind, which was, Ricky wasn't just this unhappy boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He also was the primary suspect in the disappearance of his son's fiance. He had a 22-year-old son, and his son had a fiance. Her name was Jamie Fraley. And around the same time that Kim broke up with Ricky not only became sort of obsessed with Kim and became her stalker, but he also sort of began a lot of the same behaviors with Jamie, again, his son's fiance. And about a month after Kim and Ricky had broken up, Jamie went missing. And Ricky was the primary suspect in her disappearance, and he was actively being investigated for her disappearance. So, from Kim's perspective, she knows that Ricky is, he's an ex-con, he served time for manslaughter, he knows that he's being investigated for this disappearance. And so she's constantly on edge here. Despite her restraining order, she does not feel like that's actually going to keep Ricky out of her life. She's very scared of him. And so when her alarm went off, her first thought is, it's got to be Ricky. Maybe he's broken into my car. Maybe he's setting a trap for me, whatever it is. And so as she goes outside, that's what's going through her head. Anyhow, so she gets out in the parking lot. It's blazing hot. She's got her keys in her hand, and she's looking around, but she doesn't see Ricky. Big open parking lot, bunch of cars. She sees her car. And so she clicks her key fob and turns off the alarm because it is her car that's going off. And she walks through the parking lot and she gets to her car. She kind of is careful as she's walking up to it, making sure nobody's hiding, But when she gets to her car, she sees there's no damage. The car is undamaged. All the windows are rolled up. There's certainly no sign that anybody broke into her car. And so Kim is thinking, okay, clearly what's happened here is, somebody must have just bumped into it. This has nothing to do with Ricky. This is just, I'm on edge, given what's happening in my life. And so again, she's turned off the car alarm. She checks her car, again, just to make sure, Ricky's not here, and he's not. There's nothing going on with her car. And she ends up going back into the paint shop. And so she goes back in the paint shop and she finishes up her shift. And by the time her shift ends, which was only a few hours later, she hadn't forgotten about the car alarm thing, because Ricky and sort of the torment he was causing in her life was really front of mind for her. And so when she left the paint shop now to go home, she had calmed down, but she's walking through the parking lot, going back to her car, just again on edge. She's got her keys, poking out of her hand as a weapon. She gets to her car and there's nobody there. She immediately hops inside, shuts the door, locks it, turns it on, blasts the AC. And it's she can relax. Okay, she's safe in her car. But as she's sitting there, she sort of took stock of the fact that her car was kind of a mess. Now, normally Kim was a very organized and clean person. She was very tidy. But really over the past few months that she'd been dealing with this saga, which was the Ricky saga, she had sort of, kind of fallen off on regular duties, like keeping her car clean, that type of thing. But she knew the next day, which was Sunday, she was going to be going to church early in the morning, and she had volunteered to drive some of her church friends to church. And so she's thinking as she's sitting in the car, exhausted from the day, oh, okay, the car is kind of smelly, and there's trash, and there's clothes, and there's this. She's like, I gotta clean out my car when I get home, because I don't want to, roll up to my friends tomorrow for church and have this car be smelly and gross. And so she tells herself, as soon as I get home, I'm gonna clean my car. And for what it's worth, she typically did do that. Most nights, she would clean her car out, take out the clothes, whatever. But, after her drive, finally ended and she got home, she just, she was checked out. And she's like, you know what? I know I need to take out my dirty clothes and take out the trash and clean up, but I just don't have it in me. So I'll just get up early tomorrow, I'll clean out my car, and then I'll, go about my day. So she gets out of her car, she goes into her apartment, and she goes to bed. The next morning rolls around, and she gets up, except she sleeps through her alarm. She's late. And when she looks at the clock, she realizes she does not have enough time to clean her car. She doesn't really have any time at all. She basically needs to run out of the house, get in her car, and drive and pick up her friends. Otherwise, she's going to be late. I mean, she's already late. She sprints out of her house, gets in her car, and right away, she's like, oh my goodness, it's so messy, it smells bad. And she starts driving, and she's taking trash and jamming it into the different compartments, doing her best to kind of make it look a little bit more presentable. She rolled the windows down to get some fresh air. But, she ended up picking up her friends for church. And, as soon as they get in, they're very polite. No one's going to call Kim out. They sort of know she's going through a rough time, but it was pretty obvious. They were kind of grossed out by the condition of her car. And, Kim's very apologetic. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry it smells. I'm sorry it's dirty. I should have taken care of this. Next time I will. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. And so they end up going to church. And after church, Kim went off on her own and sort of spent the day running errands. And around 6 p.m., she ends up coming back to her house. She's done for the day. She pulls into her parking space, and immediately she's like, okay, I need to clean my car. This is a full day overdue here. I gotta clean my car. And so she starts cleaning her car. She pulls a trash can over. She takes the trash out of the main cabin of the car. She takes out, work stuff and papers. And then once the interior of the car had been straightened up, she went around to the trunk, because in the trunk was her dirty clothes. And so Kim, she goes to the trunk, she opens it up, flips it open, and she freezes when she sees what's in her trunk. So to understand what she found in the trunk, we have to go back 24 hours. So 24 hours earlier, this is back on Saturday, Kim, her car alarm was going off. So it turns out she was right to suspect that potentially Ricky could have been involved with her car alarm. And I'll explain why. Every Saturday for forever, Kim had a very particular routine. Every Saturday, she would go to the gym in the morning, she would change out of her clothes, and she would put her gym clothes in the trunk, put on her work clothes, she'd go to work, and then in the evening, she would get home and take those dirty clothes out and clean them. That was her routine, and it was such a routine that, Ricky was aware of that routine. And so on Saturday, when she's at work, when the car alarm went off, it was Ricky. Ricky had broken into her car. Ricky knew that at the end of the day, she's gonna open up that trunk to take her dirty clothes from the gym and bring them inside and do the laundry. But unfortunately for Ricky, Kim didn't do that, right? So Ricky, he breaks into her car and he climbs into her trunk. And in hand is a knife. He's holding a knife. And he closes the trunk on himself, knowing again, based on her routine, that she's gonna open that up at the end of the night and he can spring out and attack her. But because of Kim's torment from Ricky and how scatterbrained she was, she didn't empty her trunk that night. And so for 24 hours, Ricky stayed in the trunk with that knife, and he eventually cooked to death. And so when she opened it up, he was dead and decomposing in the trunk, still clutching that knife. In addition to that, unfortunately, Jamie Fraley, so Ricky's son's fiance, her body was never found. She was never found. And police still suspect that Ricky had murdered her, but we don't know what happened to her. But what almost certainly happened is simply because Kim did not open the trunk that night, she saved her own life. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now, for Sarah, this was really alarming because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise. So clearly, something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive 4-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person. And so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade, and Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil. The devil's come back, and so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet. No idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the two men, they grab their guns and lanterns and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the two men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure. But quickly, as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the two husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big four-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth, and so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened here, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claim to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. And the Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the red ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite. On the evening of December 14th, 2024, a woman in her mid-30s named Priya got ready for bed inside of her home in Chehenkalo village, which is a rural community in central India. Priya put on her PJs, brushed her teeth, and then climbed into bed by herself. She was waiting for her husband, 35-year-old Anand Yadav, to finish his bath and then come in here and join her. And as Priya laid there, just waiting for her husband, she couldn't help but feel like their house was so quiet. And in many ways, the quiet of their house was this constant reminder of this really deep sadness in her life, which is, Priya really wanted a kid, but she and her husband had struggled to get pregnant. And now, they're in their mid-30s and it just seemed like time was running out. And, it's like all she wanted was a family and she didn't know if she would actually have one. Now, for Priya though, this was not some new revelation. Like this pain had been going on for years. And so like she did most nights as she laid in bed waiting for her husband, she just did her best, not to dwell on it and just think about the other things in her life that were going well, like, her relationship to her husband. They were very happy and a very healthy couple. And so she's sitting there and she's thinking about that and again, trying to be grateful when the door opens to the bathroom and Anand comes out, but he's not dressed for bed. He's wearing a bathrobe, like he hasn't gotten dressed yet. And he's acting kind of funny. And Priya, she's looking at her husband, trying to figure out like, what is he doing? Why isn't he dressed? What's going on here? When she suddenly realizes his face is like bright red. Clearly there is something wrong with her husband. And then before she can ask him what's going on, Anand just turns and runs out of their bedroom, just wearing his bathrobe. And so Priya, she gets out of bed and she chases after her husband, trying to make sense of what the heck is going on here. She gets outside and she sees her husband is now collapsed on the ground outside. And so Priya really does not know what's happening here. She has no sense of what could be wrong. And so she just runs over to her husband and she rolls him over and she's shaking him to like get him to talk to her. But all she sees is his face is still this beet red color and it's almost like he's passed out or something, like he's not responsive. And so really having no clue what else to do, she just rushed next door to her relative's house. She got some family members, they came outside and together they scooped up the non-responsive Anand, threw him in a vehicle, and they rushed him to the hospital. And when they got to the hospital, Priya leapt out of the car, leaving Anand and her family behind, and she bolts inside. She tells the front desk attendant what's going on, that her husband, he's not breathing, he's unresponsive, he's in the car. And so right away, medical staff came charging out. They went and they got Anand, they brought him inside, and before long, Priya is running behind all the doctors and nurses that are rushing Anand on a gurney through the hospital to an exam room. They get in the exam room, and even though Priya, she's kind of off to the side, she can't really see what's going on, but she can see the doctor who is primarily trying to figure out what's wrong with Anand. And she sees at first he's kind of like doing a couple things to see if he can get Anand to start reacting to him, but pretty quickly, she sees this doctor just kind of sit back, and there's this look of pity that comes over his face. And he turns and he looks over at Priya, and he tells her that, unfortunately, your husband is dead. Now for Priya, this whole thing has happened so quickly that it's almost like she can't even begin to process it. And so instead of, becoming hysterical with grief, her first thought is, how could he have died? Anand was a healthy guy. He's, 35 years old. He's in the best shape of his life. He's a happy guy with a robust social life. Like there's no reason he should be dying right now. Like what in the world happened here? What killed him? Like that's her question to the doctor. But the doctor said, he's like, I don't know. The only way we're gonna be able to figure out what happened here is to do an autopsy because there's just nothing obvious. And so sure enough, a couple of days later, the hospital's pathologist was, inside of an exam room with Anand's body laying on a table right in front of him. And this pathologist had done countless autopsies. This was, very standard work for this doctor. And so the pathologists, they went into this autopsy really not having any idea what killed this guy. But in their head, they were thinking, okay, maybe it was a sudden heart attack because this sort of seems like that could be it. And so they made their first incision on Anand's chest, and the first place they went to look was Anand's heart. But after looking at Anand's heart, they determined that no, he did not go into cardiac arrest, he did not die from a heart attack, this death was not connected to his heart. And so the pathologist naturally moved from the heart to Anand's lungs, which is another area that, he believed could have something to do with this death. But after checking those out, it was clear the lungs did not have to do with Anand's death. And so after that, the pathologist wound up checking all of Anand's organs, trying to find any sign of what killed him, but there was nothing. There was no indication that this guy should have died. Now, the pathologist was a little bit surprised because they figured, by this point, they would have had the answer of what happened to him, but it's no matter. They'd done many autopsies before where it required some, further looking to figure out what happened. And so they moved on and they made an incision in Anand's throat. And when they opened up Anand's throat, the pathologist just stepped back and gasped because in their entire career, they had never, ever seen anything like this. It would turn out that Priya was not the only one who felt deep sadness around not having a family yet. Anand as well was just really heartbroken over the idea that, he was never going to become a father. And so, without telling his wife, Anand had gone out and sought out professional help for their fertility issues. However, the type of professional help that he sought was a little bit unorthodox. Instead of going to see a licensed doctor, Anand went to see what's called a tantric, which is basically a practitioner of occult magic. And this tantric gave Anand instructions for how to perform this ritual that supposedly guaranteed, if he did it correctly, that he would be able to have his child. Anand clearly believed this tantric, and so after being given the instructions, he went out and gathered the necessary resources, and he took them home. And then on the night that he died, while Priya was in bed waiting for him, and he was in the bathroom, taking his bath or whatever, well, at some point in the bathroom, Anand performed this fertility ritual, and it killed him. Anand, per the tantric's instructions, had taken a living baby chicken, a chick, and attempted to swallow it whole. Apparently that was all he needed to do in order to have a child as he so desperately wanted, but when he swallowed this chick, it got stuck in his throat, and within minutes, he suffocated to death. And also, unfortunately, the chick died as well.
In 1982, a young boy named Leandro was living in southern Brazil with his family. One morning, he got up and went downstairs in his house, and he began looking for his beloved family pet, a tiny young red-footed tortoise named Manuela. The first place he looked was the back room of the first floor, where Manuela spent most of her time, but she wasn't in there. So he decided to search the rest of the first floor, where Manuela was allowed to free roam, but rarely did. But after looking around, he still couldn't find her. He knew she was too little to climb up the stairs to the second floor, so he figured she had to be hiding somewhere on the first floor. So he ran into his kitchen where his family was getting ready for the day, and he enlisted their help to go looking for her. Within an hour, they had turned the entire house upside down and had made their way out into their backyard, but there was still no sign of the little tortoise. And so while Leandro and his siblings were running around their backyard yelling out for Manuela, their father called them over and told them that unfortunately, Manuela was gone. Most likely, she slipped out of one of the doors that had been left open and had found her way into the nearby forest that butted up against their property. Leandro and his siblings begged their father to go looking for Manuela in the forest, but he told them that because she was so small, it would be nearly impossible to find her. Leandro was crushed, and he just prayed that someday that little tortoise would come back to him. 30 years later, in 2013, Leandro and his siblings were now grown adults and had moved out and had started lives of their own. But in January of that year, their father passed away, and so the kids decided to go back to the family home and clear out some of his old possessions. The father was a bit of a hoarder and was always on the lookout for old TVs and microwaves and furniture that other people had thrown away. And he would snatch these things up, he would bring them to his house and stuff them into his upstairs storage closet, promising his family he planned on fixing these things up. But he never did, and over time, as he collected more and more junk, that closet became so packed that Leandro's father couldn't even go inside of it, and so it was kind of just sealed off and forgotten about. Now that he was gone, the kids knew they would have to go in there and get rid of all that junk. They began hauling all of the stuff out and onto the curb for the trash collectors to pick up, and at one point, Leandro picked up a big heavy box that looked like an old record player, and so he brought it outside, he set it on his curb, and then he turned around to walk back towards the house when his neighbor, who had been outside the whole time, jokingly yelled to him, "Hey, are you going to throw away this tortoise too?" And Leandro turned around, and there, poking its head out of the old record box, was Manuela the tortoise, happy and healthy as can be. 30 years earlier, Manuela had managed to climb inside of this old record box when their father had brought it home, and then the father brought that box upstairs and put it inside of his storage closet along with Manuela. Once she was inside this closet, Manuela just carved out a life for herself. She transformed the record box into her home, and she would leave it to eat termites and other insects and lick condensation off the walls. Red-footed tortoises are known for being extremely resilient. When food is scarce, they can go 2 to 3 years between meals. And if after that there's still no food, they can lower their body temperatures and other physiological processes and enter into this state of suspended animation that allows them to go even longer without sustenance. Because of this, it's no wonder that tortoises like Manuela live for at least 50 years on average. Leandro rushed over to Manuela, he scooped her up. He had missed her so much he could not believe he was looking at her again. And while Manuela had been doing just fine inside of her closet, she was no doubt very pleased to be reunited with her family. Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was Titu, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. Titu, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like Titu was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. Titu was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why Titu was throwing this tantrum, because Titu threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken Titu to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, "Look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, Titu turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed. And Titu, at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current Titu tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was Titu looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, Titu had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to Titu, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as Titu inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's gonna calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. Titu in the bedroom began saying the word Shirsh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant.
But, T2, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing T2 start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at T2 to explain what Shursh Verma meant, but T2 had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again. Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly, and so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, Shursh Verma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And T2 had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all T2 wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when T2's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, T2 would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. T2 would also walk around their house, and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, T2 would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, and why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that T2 basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of T2's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but T2 had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time T2 began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, T2 would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after T2 had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But T2 did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, T2 would randomly attack another small child with a sugarcane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass, and T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that T2 will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking T2 out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that T2 kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums. Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, T2 began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, Shirsh Verma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of T2's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But T2 was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and he asked his mother, "Hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra?" Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that T2 was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as T2 ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance, and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop T2 from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where T2 had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to T2 to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained T2 so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, T2 just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. T2, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, "Why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me?" And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once T2 fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, "Tomorrow, we're going to have visitors." The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house, and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, "Hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests." And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying because she knew, even before T2 had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck, and then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, "No, I don't." And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, "I know who you are. You're Uma." And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. And he said to her, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets?" And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen, and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to T2, she pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with T2. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to T2, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that T2 said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop, and when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with T2. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed, and so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma, the two words that T2 would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with T2's birth. And all of T2's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with T2 was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered T2's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in T2. This reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to T2, so he's saying his name over and over again. And then also T2's obsession with Agra would make sense, because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in T2's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that T2 had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear, right here. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors. She cut the hair away around T2's ear, revealing the two birthmarks. And then the other families saw those birthmarks, and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when T2's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with T2, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about T2 and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected T2 to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what T2 wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see T2 and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for T2, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And T2 has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India.
During a busy 2009 weekend on a popular river in Florida, two boats collided. Within minutes, one of them, a 40-foot-long pleasure craft, had sank. Luckily, all the passengers on both boats survived, but unluckily, where the sunk boat finally landed underwater was not very deep, and it was just barely outside of a main shipping channel, which meant if it didn't get moved, someone was eventually going to run into it. The marina owner contacted a local commercial diver and asked him if he would come out and lift this boat up and move it, but that diver was not going to be available for several weeks, and he was asking for too much money. So the marina owner reached out to another local diver diver, a guy by the name of Tim, and offered him the job. Tim was not a commercial diver. He was a 43-year-old recreational diver who was well known in the area and had lots of diving experience. But in terms of experience lifting 40-foot crafts off the bottom of the river, Tim had no experience. But Tim was excited at this challenge being presented to him, and so he accepted the deal and offered to do it for half the money the commercial diver was asking for. Even though Tim had never raised a boat before, he knew it was going to require a lot of lift bags around the boat. Lift bags are like these big durable balloons that you can inflate and deflate underwater. But before Tim could just go down and start placing these bags, he needed to do a survey dive where he just went down and checked out the wreckage, saw it for himself, and figured out how many lift bags he would need and where he would place them. So on September 12th, Tim threw all of his dive gear into his truck, he left the marina and drove over to a parking lot that butted up against the shipping channel. Tim hopped out, leaving his gear in the truck. He walked down to the edge of the riverbank and he scanned out across the river looking for the buoy that the marina owner had told him was out there, designating where the shipwreck was. Once he found it and saw that it was not very far from where he was, he just walked back up to his truck, grabbed his gear, came back down to the water's edge. He jocked up, then hopped in the water and swam out to the buoy. Once he was there, he placed his diver down flag on the buoy. This is a flag that signifies to anybody in the area that there is a diver below them, and then he made his descent. Tim didn't expect to be underwater for very long, and because he was a very experienced diver, he probably thought this dive was going to be extremely routine. And so for those reasons, he had elected not to bring a dive partner with him. This is a huge no-no in the diving community, especially if you're going to be diving in a hazardous environment like a shipwreck. But Tim was confident, so he broke that rule. One of the pieces of gear that Tim had brought with him was a diver propulsion vehicle, or DPV for short. These DPVs come in all shapes and sizes, but what you should picture in your head is like a little torpedo with a propeller on the back, and the diver holds on to this torpedo and controls the speed using a throttle and basically just rockets around underwater. The current in the river that Tim was going to be in was fairly strong, and so Tim brought his DPV to help him stay near the shipwreck as he inspected it. After Tim went subsurface, he grabbed his scooter and began going straight down, and the water was not very clear, so he couldn't see the shipwreck at first. But after going down about 50 feet, he saw this beautiful boat. It was perched on its side on this fairly steep embankment with its nose pointing in the direction the current was flowing. Right away, Tim got to work swimming around the shipwreck, looking for different points on the boat where he could attach lift bags and marking those locations on his diver's slate, which is like a dry erase board. But after going around the boat several times, Tim had not seen the actual impact site on the side of the boat that caused it to sink in the first place, and he wondered if it was hidden on the side of the boat that was laying in the sand. And so Tim decided he wanted to go down and have a look, and so he went down to where the sand met the boat, but as soon as he got down there, he kicked up all the mud and the sand and it killed his visibility. And so he grabbed onto the side of the boat and he picked up his DPV and turned it on with the propellers pointed back towards where the mud and the sand was, and he kind of used the propellers of the DPV like a leaf blower and blew the mud and sand out of his field of vision. And it worked great, but he couldn't see the impact site. And so he got underneath the boat and got closer and closer to where the actual metal of the boat was pressing up against the sand and just continued to blow away the mud and sand to get a better look, when all of a sudden the ship lurched forward and came to a stop on Tim's legs. He couldn't move, he was totally trapped. When Tim had used his DPV to clear away the mud and sand, he had also blown away some of the mud and sand that was keeping the boat from sliding farther down the embankment. And so when it got blown away, the boat became unsteady and it came to rest on top of Tim. When Tim was not able to pull his legs out from under this incredibly heavy boat, he most likely used the DPV to continue to erode the mud and sand around the boat to try to get it to continue to slide down off of his legs. But he wasn't able to do that because the boat was basically wedged up against his legs. Tim's legs were the thing keeping the boat from sliding any farther. And because Tim did not bring a dive partner, there was literally no one there to save him. And even though he had told the marina owner that he was going out to survey the wreck, he had not given his timeline, so no one was expecting him. And so he would have realized very quickly that there was virtually nothing he could do but wait to die. Several hours later, someone on the surface noticed Tim's diver down flag on that buoy and called in the authorities. When the fire department's dive team went down to the wreckage, they found Tim. He was still trapped underneath the boat. He had run out of air and he had drowned.